So good evening, everyone. And what? There we go. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth event in this year's Tecnoglass lecture series. I'm Joel Lemire, coordinator of the series and an assistant professor here in the University of Miami School of Architecture. As always, I have to start with my sincere thanks to Tecnoglass for their support. It has been a privilege to curate the speakers in this series, and their talks have been truly enlightening. After each one, I sort of spend the next day in a kind of contemplative fog, playing through how my practice and teaching can and should be better. I expect the same kind of jolt today after we hear Chris Cornelius speak, but more on that in a moment. The bottom line is that Tecnoglass has long contributed to our intellectual culture here at USOA through this ambitious series, and for that, I thank them heartily. One piece of quick housekeeping to share before we dive in is that, as you know, the AIA offers continuing education credits for these events. And if you're interested in receiving those credits, you have to email Stephen Fett, SFETT @miami.edu. I think we'll hopefully paste that into the Zoom chat as well at some point for those who are joining us online. All right, so today it is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Chris Cornelius. I will do that quickly so that we give him plenty of time to speak, of course, but also so that we leave a little bit of space for Q&A at the end. Our own Joaquin Perez will be leading that, and we encourage audience questions as well from all of you. Chris Cornelius is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and the founding principal of Studio Indigenous. He is also the brand new chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of New Mexico. This last bit was actually announced 1 week after I wrote to ask him to participate in this series, which makes me feel a bit prophetic, actually. But of course, the truth has nothing to do with my own skills in forecasting, and everything to do with the fact that the discipline is finally starting to reckon with some of its own shortcomings. Yeah, and that's ultimately the theme of this lecture series, opting in. Faced with many parallel crises, including accelerating climate change, rampant economic inequities, structural oppression by race and gender, intensifying refugee movement and militarized borders, among others, we really just can't be content with architecture that aims to reinforce the status quo. We need profound change in how we work and who we work for. Chris Cornelius, through practice and teaching, offers such a profound reordering of the discipline. In particular, in calling for a decolonized architecture that embraces Indigenous thinking and values. He emphasizes empathy, ecology, sovereignty, and cultural rootedness. In a broad view, I see these values as powerful critiques of the most problematic aspects of architecture today. Architecture has historically been complicit in so much of the colonialist project, facilitating its various acts of dominance, right, over land, over resources, over people. Indigenous thinking contains both a necessary corrective to that problematic history and an alternative ethos for a more promising future. So Chris Cornelius's distinctions and accolades are many. I won't list them all, but in addition to being included in the 2018 Venice Biennale, he also won the 2017 Miller Prize from Exhibit Columbus. He's taught at UVA, Yale, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and as I mentioned a moment ago, he is the new chair at the University of New Mexico. You know, I'm really thrilled that he is joining us tonight. He's a perfect addition to this series. I couldn't be happier to have him. And, you know, not only is he joining us, I sort of feel like he's bringing with him an optimism about what can still come. So on behalf of the School of Architecture and the University of Miami and Tecnoglass, please join me in welcoming Chris Cornelius.
Thank you for the introduction. Watkuf Noela Du, Chris Nyongets, Aquahoni Wagito Loda, Okele, Oniata Aga, Nuwagadun Choda. So I said in the Oneida language that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. So I'm going to share a number, or really just 3 themes that kind of help frame my work and the work that has been ongoing and I have been doing for quite a while, and thinking about how I integrate my own culture into my architectural design in the ways that I think about architectural curriculum as well. when we study architecture, we're familiar with this image, right? We're familiar with the duck and the decorated shed by Venturi and Scott Brown. For me, as a graduate student at UVA, when I started to really look at how contemporary architecture was being made for Indigenous people, I saw some similarities between that architecture and this image. Some of the buildings are what I call zoomorphs. They're buildings that are shaped like animals. This is the elementary school that's on my reservation. It was built in the 90s. It's a turtle. The gym is in the head. The kindergarten is in the tail. The classrooms are under the shell. The head has eyes. But there are a number of buildings like this across the US and Canada. Other buildings that are turtles. Some are bears. Some are thunderbirds from the sky. And so there was a sort of category of buildings that I called the zoomorph. The other was a pictograph, that these were normal buildings, but they had Indigenous iconography applied to them. And I think in both of these cases, they don't particularly indigenize the architecture. They don't really explain what the importance of the turtle is, for instance, to the culture. And I felt like in order for this to really have resonance with people, it had to be a true translation, and it had to be experiential, and it had to be the architecture itself had to be the setting for that translation. Another thing I wanted to share about my work, and something that I'm sort of compelled by from my own culture, from Indigenous culture, is this notion that the ways that we name places are often tied to stories. And so this is an example. It's called Bear's Ears. There are 4 language here of the people that are Indigenous to this area, the Southwest. I won't try to pronounce those, but they all basically translate into Bear's Ears. And so when you look at this geological formation, if you can imagine a bear that's partially submerged or mostly submerged, and its ears are just showing, that's where this comes from. And so these stories, they start to tell us about the place, the importance, but I believe they also tell us about history. They tell us about technology. They tell us about science. They're not just there to be entertaining. They're actually part of an Indigenous knowledge system. And so these are the things that I begin to think about as I design for Indigenous people. So the first theme I want to share with you is called Design as Ceremony. And the idea that design itself is not just a task for us to complete, that it is a ceremony, and that ceremony has rituals and responsibilities. I think about it as a person that's putting designed objects into the world. What are my responsibilities to the world and to its inhabitants, to the context, both through the cultural context and the physical context that I'm placing these things within, and how do I begin to think about that? I started my practice with this project. I was asked to be a consulting designer with Antoine Predock, who was selected as the design architect for the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. He was selected through an invited competition, and the school required that they had an Indigenous designer on the team. And so Antoine selected me to collaborate with on the project. It is a K4 through 8 private school. It's a endowed school. Students only have to prove Native ancestry to attend the school. There are about 350 students, but it's also a center of community. It's also a nonprofit corporation. The school itself was started in the late 60s by 3 mothers in Milwaukee who were, they weren't happy with how Indigenous history and culture were being taught to their children in public schools in Milwaukee. So they pulled them out of the public schools and started their own school. And then later on, the evolution of the school through its endowment purchased this land, nearly 200 acres just southwest of Milwaukee. And so one of the things that was really important to me to communicate to Antoine and to think about as a designer was the complicated relationship between Indigenous people and education. And I think to say that it's complicated is an understatement, because the educational system and boarding schools and other types of schools were used as a means to assimilate Indigenous people. And in many ways, I think we could see them as tools of genocide. We're now seeing that the truth being uncovered in Canada and the US, where we're finding young people who have lost their lives at these schools. But It also, the flip side of that is that it is a positive. I think of it as a kind of emancipation. It is the thing that got me to where I am. It is the education that is. It is the thing that got me into a profession and maybe an academic. So I think that it can be a positive tool as well. But one of the things we did with the school, we stripped all the institutional names from things. And for instance, the place that they eat, we've never ever called it the cafeteria. The school's been open now for 14 plus years, and they still don't call it the cafeteria. They call it feast. The place that you enter is called the lobby. We're looking at the student entrance, that's called migration. And students still call it those things. And so I believe that the ways that things are named, it forces the way that we think about them, right? If we think about them in a sort of programmatic only manner, then we'll always think of them that way. We were trying to give them characteristics and qualities and tie them to the culture as well. And so that was our goal in naming these different spaces. This is the the second story, the middle school grades 6 through 8. And we thought of that as a rite of passage. So the stairway that goes from the elementary school grades to the middle school grades is called Earth to Sky. The second level is about the sky. There's a lot of clear story natural light, but you'll see the tree columns here. The trees were harvested from the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. Trees are really important to that culture. They've always sustainably harvested their trees. These trees were taken down in ceremony. They were seen as giving their lives to the school, and many of them are over 300 years old. So they hold stories. They hold stories of pre-European contact. When we look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, we can see where the Menominee Nation actually is. It's this patch right here that almost looks like a glitch or a Photoshop. It's because, again, they've always sustainably harvested their forest, and that is their reservation boundary. The Menominee actually occupied and are indigenous to a good portion of the eastern part of the state. So this is the boundary that was set by the federal government for their reservation. And again, like I said, the trees came from them. Some of the things that I did was I created this graphic of everything from the surface of the site all the way to the moon. It varies in vertical scale. And this was a way to begin to investigate what are the lessons that we can learn from the current inhabitants, the animals that burrow into the ground, that burrow below the frost line. What are the things that are at the immediate site? What are the things that migrate above the site? Where are the seasonal winds? Where is airline traffic? Where is the weather system within our atmosphere? Where does most space travel happen? All the way up to the moon. To understand that when we're designing something at the surface, we're actually intervening in a much larger system, and that system has reciprocities, and the architecture should respond to that. And so we began to think about how were we going to respond to that thing in this sort of very large stratigraphy of objects, right? To begin to think about how a building is going to live within that. One of the key concepts in indigeneity that I want to share is this idea of relationality, the idea that we're related. So when you hear indigenous people talk about the earth as our mother, the moon is our grandmother, the sky is our father, we mean that. We mean that we are related to them, right? And that's our familial relationship is like that. We often talk about our non-human relatives as relatives. And in many indigenous cultures, there's a concept that basically translates into all my relations, meaning all living things, including stones. Stones are our grandfathers. We see them as living, and it's that relationship that's really quite important. And I believe that we should begin to think about buildings as if we were related to them. We would think about the responsibilities we have as designers quite differently. And we begin to think about the spaces we're making, the materials we're selecting, the people who are building the building, the people who are occupying it, cleaning it. What is the life of this thing? Where will it be in 50 years? All of those things are important things to begin to think about, this familial relationship. Another thing we see in architecture school is this Logier's frontispiece, which is a sort of retelling of the origins of architecture, where the architect is pointing at nature, and we're seeing nature being used and its relationship to architecture. And I oppose that with the indigenous view of nature and how architecture was really sort of part of our culture, but it was never really separated out or talked about specifically, but it is intended to be integrated with nature, right, in this very closely related manner. On the right, nature is seen as a commodity, is seen as a raw material to be used in service of architecture, that the humans have dominion over it, and that sort of relationship is a one that is vertical. In this case, it is a relationship that we are related to these things, right? And that's where I believe if we thought about buildings as if we were related to them, we would think about the responsibilities of putting them into the world quite differently. And so the relationship to nature, I think, is really clear in either of these images. In this first one, nature is mine, right? Mine to possess and to use and as a raw material. The other is that nature is me, that I'm actually a part of this. Personally, I'm part of this, and what I'm doing and creating is also a part of this. And I think that's how we should be thinking about it. In Indigenous culture, we talk about plants as being our oldest relatives. Plants show us things. They've been through a lot, right? They've been through drought. They've been through good growing seasons, bad growing seasons. Those plants can be medicines. They can be food. They have a lot of roles and responsibilities. And so we see them as our oldest relatives. I think buildings are our youngest relatives. If we thought of them as our youngest relatives and we thought about them as a designer, I'm putting this thing into the world, I have responsibility for that, right? This thing breathes, it sweats, it produces waste. How can we make this thing be responsible? How can we think about this thing as having a very close relationship to the context that we're putting it in, both physically, culturally, and globally? I think that we begin to think about them differently. And I think we have responsibilities as designers when we're putting these things into the world, right? And I think that that's true of not just rural sites and open sites, but it's true of urban sites as well. Urban areas have their own sort of context and they have their own sort of life, and they're different kinds of relatives. And so if we thought about them as our relatives, we would begin to think about the responsibilities we have as designers when we're making them. I want to share some other work with you that was really speculative work. This was a time when I didn't have many commissioned projects, and I didn't have any grants or anything. I just kind of basically give myself a series of assignments. But to be honest, I really wanted to explore this idea of what if it was unclear who the architect was. Is it a person? Is it an animal? Is it some other entity? Is it some other phenomena? And so in these series of models that I made, one, I was interested in the sort of materiality of making models out of metals, basically soldering them and manipulating different kinds of metals. So most of them are made of brass, bronze, copper mesh. And I use these found boxes as the sites, right? Because when we get a site as a designer, we can't really change it. We can't make it bigger. We can't make it smaller. It has a history. It has a given set of dimensions. And so I use these found object boxes to place these models within. This happens to be an old sewing machine base that I put this thing in. And I also decided that I wasn't going to use people as the scale figures, that I would use animals, and that the animals would be interacting with this architecture. And the architecture itself is intended to be an extension of how we inhabit and reconcile ourselves as beings, living beings within the world. So this one is called Moonscope. It's a place to lay down and see the moon. This one is called Bivouac, an improvised shelter. And so in some cases, these things are what I would call three-dimensional sketches. I didn't have a plan or a drawing of making them. So they're also intended to sort of critique this idea of models always being scalar representations of the architecture, right? Like the model comes after the drawing and before the building, that the model itself could be an object of itself and doesn't always have to have that sort of linear relationship. It can actually be part of the design tool and the ways that I'm thinking. So for me, some of them started as drawings or sketches within my sketchbook, but they were just explorations. So like the one on the left is about like, how can I start to make cladding like an eagle's feathers? Or how could I start to play with the moire patterns that happen with these different types of mesh? Or what happens when I just didn't cut any of the wires, I just let them extend for this other object that is a place to see the moon. And so in many ways for me, these were things, exercises that I did to keep myself nimble as a designer. I think it's important to begin to think about not every sort of design task that we have is one where there is a specific outcome, right? That in many cases, there are ways to keep ourselves in these design aspects kind of nimble. And I was also interested in this idea of improvised structures. There was a structure on my reservation when I grew up, which had this sort of mystery and mythology around it. And I was interested by that very thing. And so that's kind of what stems in, motivated me to make these sort of objects myself. And so many of them, you'll see the influences of them, and I'll show you some of the influences of them in later work, especially in the installation work, where they became part of the ways that I was thinking. So one of the installations that I did was this one. I called it Trickster. It is in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just 45 minutes north of Milwaukee. It's a children's literature garden. And so this was part of a residency. And when I wrote the proposal for the residency, I wanted to bring attention to the role of the trickster in Indigenous storytelling. That the trickster is there to tell us about our own humanity. Oftentimes it's an animal. For some nations, it's a different type of animal. Sometimes it's a rabbit, sometimes it's a coyote, sometimes it's other types of rabbit, jackrabbits, or it's some other phenomena. It's some sort of hybrid of animal or something you can't see or feel, or it could even be a person in many cases. But in this case, I wanted to make a thing that was basically didn't have associations with form or program. So it wasn't quite a pavilion. Doesn't really stand for anything, but is really this idea of the trickster. And so it's intended to be there so that the visitors, the children visitors, can begin to tell their own stories about it. I heard one young woman telling a story about how she didn't quite know how it got there. It looked like a thing that was there when animals were here first, and then humans came. And to me, that was the real sort of understanding of what I was trying to accomplish. I made it from trees that were harvested on the site, and I used a copper mesh, similar copper mesh, almost actually the exact copper mesh that I was using on the models in making this full scale thing. And so you can see it's loosely based on this model that's called Bear on the left. To make the structure and clad it in this mesh. And then I was really interested in how you patina this copper and using different techniques to begin to do that. The other thing I was interested in especially when I made the models and then when I started making these installations, was the idea of regalia in an Indigenous culture, because it's more than ornament. It's more than just aesthetic. It tells us where people are from, what they're associated with, what families, what clans, what their role in their nation is. So on the right is the headdress of, it's a Haudenosaunee headdress. It's for the Mohawk. I'm Oneida. We're part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, along with the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Tuscarora. And we know that it's Mohawk because of the 3 feathers on the top, 3 feathers that are up. If it were 2 feathers up and 1 feather down, we would know that person was Oneida. So each of the tribes had their own feather configuration. The other thing about it, the headdress is called the Gastoe, but the other thing we know about the Gastoe is that because it has antlers, this belonged to a chief. The chiefs wore antlers. The chiefs were elected. It wasn't a hereditary thing. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy I think it's the first democracy in the world, documented democracy. It's also the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. There's historical evidence of Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams studying the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And there are many parallels between it, between the Confederacy itself and our U.S. Constitution. So this piece was there for about 2 years. It was a temporary pavilion. It won the Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award for temporary installation. My friends from Spirit of Space made this film, and I didn't tell them how to film it or what story to tell. They're excellent storytellers, and I love the way that they filmed the piece. They filmed it as if it were an animal. If you got too close to it, you might scare it. And so when they filmed my pieces, I really learned a lot more about the piece than I had it really kind of intended. And I love the way that they tell stories and make films. They make films for Jeannie Gang and Stephen Hall, a bunch of people all over the world. They make architecture films for them. So the piece, like I said, was they filmed it in 2019 in the snow, but it came down in 2020. I made a second Trickster for the Knoll Fellowship, was an artist fellowship that I received in Milwaukee. It's the 4-county area there. The Mary L. Knoll Foundation, they select 2 established artists. I was one of the established artists, and they select 3 emerging artists. And we have a group show at the Haggerty Museum at Marquette University in Milwaukee. So I made a second Trickster indoors. These trees were harvested from the Linden Sculpture Garden. They were basically the trees that were felled trees, part of their maintenance. So I selected them, brought them into the exhibition space. The Trickster is also a device for me to speak through. A device for me to think about it as a character, to think about it as an architectural character. How did it get here? What is its sort of mystery? And in this case, because it was indoors, I got to play a little bit more with the regalia. You can see the antlers on here, the wires. We're not quite sure whether these antlers are a trophy that the Trickster won or stole or cheated. Like, those are the types of lessons that the Trickster tells us in the stories. We see the Trickster do things, we see the consequences of the Trickster doing those things, and the lessons of the story are intended to teach us about the things that we should and shouldn't do, and how we should or shouldn't treat each other. Again, it's loosely based on this model. So I really started to get interested in how can I translate the things that I'm doing at scale in a model to full scale? Are there ways of beginning to translate the language that I can do at that scale in a full scale? And so the wires at the top are the sort of translation of that, the way that the frame sort of kind of ends and creates a sort of triangulated form for the copper mesh. When I'm putting this copper mesh on, I feel like I'm making a shirt for a giant bear. I'm trying to conceal the fasteners. I have to fold it over. I don't have any preconceived plan, diagram, model, or drawing of how I'm going to do this. I just basically make the frame, triangulate the frame so that the span of the mesh isn't too large that it begins to sag, but how it gets seamed together. In that way, there's a dialogue between me and the piece. There's a dialogue between me and the form of the thing, the weight of the thing, the height of the thing. All of those things are part of the way that the piece begins to speak to me. And like I said, the Trickster is a thing for me to speak through, right? And so the Trickster wants to remind you that you're on Indigenous land, that even the institutions of higher learning are on Indigenous land, and museums are on Indigenous land. If we're in North America, we're on Indigenous land, and the Trickster is there to begin to tell us that. The first installation that I did was for the Miller Prize. I was one of 10 designers selected to compete for 5 prizes, and the prize was the funds to build a installation in Columbus, Indiana. We were assigned the sites. There were 5 different sites. I was assigned First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen. His son Eero Saarinen was built in 1942. I believe it's the first modernist church in the U.S. And it started the architecture program of Columbus, Indiana. If you don't know about Columbus, Indiana, it's really an amazing place in the United States. It's where Cummins Diesel is headquartered. Mr. Miller ran Cummins Diesel, and he started the architecture program there. The architecture program was one where Cummins would pay the program itself was funded by Cummins, but the program paid the architectural fees for public buildings as long as they got to select who the architects were that you could pick from for all their public buildings. So across the street is one of I.M. Pei's first projects, the public library. So they would give them a list of these sort of famous architects. The library got to select who they wanted to hire to design their project, and they would pay the architectural fees. This is an ongoing program. So there are a number of Eero Saarinen buildings there. Harry Weiss buildings. There's a Deborah Burke building there. So the program is still ongoing and still continues today. But part of the Miller Prize was to help kind of extend that kind of culture within Columbus. So when I was selected, I won the competition. What I wanted to do was to draw attention to the people that were Indigenous to that area, the people that were Indigenous to that area of South Central Indiana. The Indigenous history there was one that was erased very quickly. And the irony there is obviously that Indiana is named after Indians. buildings, right? And that this history was actually a little bit difficult to start to uncover. I had people at the museums there to help me uncover that. But it was the Miami people, or Miamia, that were indigenous to that area. And they, like many Great Lakes cultures, built wigwams. They built these structures that were wood saplings that were bent over into this dome shape, and then they were clad with either reed mats or bark shingles, and they were there as a sort of structure that had a fire within it, and people could dwell within it. And so I wanted people to begin to understand that history existed. Another thing that I wanted to draw attention to is that when we look at Indigenous art, and what we're looking at on the right is the traditional Miami craft of ribbon cutting, which makes these intricate patterns that are overlaid with one another. When we look at Indigenous art, we should see it as a reflection of nature. It's usually oftentimes the ways that Indigenous people see nature. And so it could be a reference to like the eagle's feathers or fish scales or other sorts of things. And so I began to think about that. What are the architectural ways that I could begin to translate that? So I decided to do that, especially in the cladding of the piece. It's made out of steel rebar. And so instead of bending it over, I bent it up into this shape. It's a series of ellipses that are wafted together. And the cladding is in expanded steel. I call it its feathers. It's panelized. And we used Grasshopper to kind of figure out the panels are all water jet cut and put onto the structure. And just like the eagle's feathers, they change size when they change shape and curvature, right? So towards the back, they're much bigger. And as we get around the front, they become smaller. There's 3 sizes of panel. But the piece itself is intended to be a physical land acknowledgement for people to begin to understand the history of that place and to start that conversation, right? To begin to think about the people that are indigenous to that area. How do we begin to start these conversations about what lessons can we learn from the people that were indigenous to that area, right? That I think they have very specific thoughts of how we are to inhabit these landscapes and how do we begin to create these dialogues. So the piece I situated in this tree canopy. There's this cavity within that canopy on the site of the church. Its in section is angled towards the fall equinox, which would be a solar event that would happen during the exhibition. The exhibition was originally from August to November. My piece was actually there for about 2 years instead of just the 3 months. But on that day, the sun comes through the top and through the door, so it lets the maximum amount of light within it. In many ways, I see the piece as an animal. It sleeps at night. It inhabits the site. It also is having a conversation with the Saarinen, a conversation that I don't know what it is, right? But me as the designer, facilitator of that, I've created this sort of forum for that. I didn't try to intentionally make any sort of commentary on the Saarinen piece. They didn't ask us to do that. But what I really wanted to do was to say, well, what happens when we place another piece of architecture on this great piece of architecture? For me, it was that I didn't program this space. It was just a space for people to gather in. It got used in different ways. The library used it as a storytelling space. There was a group of Indigenous language code talkers that were used in various wars, but mostly in World War II, where they spoke their Indigenous language because the enemies couldn't speak that language. They couldn't translate it or crack it as a code. They had a gathering here. There was a dance company that choreographed a piece around it. But for me, it was a thing to begin to think about how are we thinking about space, right? And how do we begin to think about the people that were indigenous to that area? And how can I begin to facilitate those conversations? And it was intended to do that. The second thing that I want to share with you is drawing is medicine. For me, drawing is a part of that ceremony. It's part of the way that I design. It's a big part of the way that I think. And I began to think about drawing when I first was really as an architecture student, but really began to think about when I received an artist residency from the National Museum of the American Indian, where my drawing started to become part of, in my sketchbook, that is part of the works themselves. And in that exercise, I didn't erase anything, and I haven't erased anything in my sketchbooks. I believe that we draw how we think. So ideas that when we start ideas, we might draw very lightly. As ideas become more concrete, we might start to darken them in. I start to watercolor them so that they start to come out and the other ideas start to recede. And so I think that when we should see how we begin to think about how we draw things, right? And how we begin to formulate them. So for me, drawing is a part of that exercise where I always try to draw something. I might not be able to articulate what it is, but I believe that the inspiration can find us drawing. I don't necessarily believe in the sort of like writer's block or creative block, or when we're staring at a blank piece of paper. As long as we're drawing, we're thinking. And our brain, I think as designers, we cognitively use multiple parts of our brain, and we're not always using the parts that are instinctual, right? The ones that are just about hunches and feelings and senses. When we're drawing, we should just be drawing. And as students, I think that we should always be drawing, but those drawings, you don't have to show those drawings to your professors or anyone else. They could be just for you, but always be drawing. I fill about 2 of these sketchbooks a year, and I use them for projects. I use them travel sketches, ideas, things that I'm reading, notes that I'm taking. I'm always trying to be drawing and to sort of facilitate that language. So I started to draw in a very speculative way. I began to think about, again, like the models, I began to think about what if there was an architecture, again, that wasn't quite clear whether it was made by animals or humans. And I decided to use my tribe's moon calendar. Many indigenous cultures have this calendar of moons, and it's usually based on the new moon. But the moons are named by things that are happening in the environment or ceremonies or cultural activities, right? So for my culture, the Oneida gathering maple syrup is part of our culture, so that's one of the moons. It's when the sap begins to flow. There's a clap of thunder that wakes up the trees. That's when that moon is present. And some of these moons are about planting, harvesting, hunting, resting. But what I'm intentionally trying not to do is to make a metaphor for the moon, right? Like I didn't want to make architecture that was a metaphor for this particular moon. So it's really actually based on, I made forms based on data, that's wind data of that particular time of year. And that form gets reconstituted in different ways. So for this maple syrup moon, it's about the top of it, this canopy. So I decided to make these things all have a series of similar parameters. They're all the same proportion. They're all displaced from the ground, the same amount. They have a top. They have these antennae that may communicate with one another. And again, you can see in these drawings that there's layers within the drawings, little notes, there's other things. When I'm drawing, I'm not erasing. But in this case, I begin to think about the structure of them differently for each one. So in this case, what if it was like a deer's legs? Do we know if this thing ran here? Did it just stop, or is it moving when I'm not looking at it? To think of it as a kind of character. And each one of them has different ways to get into them. They all have the same proportion. So I also, when I was doing these drawings in my sketchbook, I was also making digital models of them, and I originally started making the digital models to be able to cast the shadows correctly in the elevations. But I began to realize, well, what if I use the modeling as a tool and I change the way that I start to render these things as well? So in this one, which is the food storing moon, I decided to make this from the wolf's eye point of view, right? Instead of this human eye level camera shot that we're always using, what if I started to do this as an animal that's looking up at this? And in this case, in this one, instead of columns, what if it was a series of hair, right? Like almost like porcupine quills or something like that. There was enough hair on the thing to structurally hold it up. And then when the wolf looks up into the sky, does the wolf see things that I can't see as a human? We know that birds can see things that we can't see as humans, right? They can see magnetism. It's in the sky. It's the thing that they use to migrate. So when they know when to fly towards it and when to fly away from it. But what if the wolf was also seeing things within the sky? Those are things that I can render visible through these digital tools. And I began to really start to rethink using the digital rendering as more than just a way to accurately render material and light and space, but to give us other aspects of the ways that I'm thinking about the architecture. Can we begin to expand the ways that we're thinking about how we represent our work, both digitally and in an analog sort of drawing manner? Some of these drawings, like this one, won a K-Rob prize for best physical delineation. In this case, I was just wondering, what if instead of columns again, what if it was a bundle of sticks? What if there was just so many sticks that were bundled underneath it that could hold it up? What if I used the wind data to create this wing form? And so when I think of these things as analogies, for instance, like the wing form, I put the wing into the drawing, into the sketchbook. We see the bear there is pulling out this thing that is used to irrigate the landscape. So when these thoughts come into my mind, I just wrote this quick note. I roll out a cloud to make my own rain when there isn't any. And so we see the bear pulling that out. So each one of these, and I'm trying to draw in a very sort of instinctual way. Again, I'm trying to keep my part of my brain as an architect that is trying to say, well, you can't do this, or this should be this thick or this thin or whatever it is, to make these assessments before, right? And so as a creative person, I think it's important for us to let those things flow out in the ways that we're representing them. So for instance, in each of these drawings, you see these kind of circles that go around them. For me, in this process of making this drawing, I just felt like there should be something flying around it. I don't know what that thing is. I don't know if it's a bird. I don't know if it's technology. I don't know if it's temperature. I don't know if it's moisture. I don't know if it's all of the above, but it just felt like something should be flying around it. So I started to draw these things around it. It's actually the last thing I do when I'm drawing, because I want to be accurate about what is going over, what is going behind, how it comes underneath. Is it going through anything, to see it as an object? And I splash watercolor on these as well. Each of these drawings have a kind of underdrawing where I start to draw in it. And again, when I begin to watercolor it, those things begin to recede in different ways. And so at this one, in the Thunder Moon, I thought of it having an apparatus at the top for me to be able to hear the clap of thunder. And that reminded me of a deer's ear. So I put the deer into it. So it wasn't, again, it wasn't a metaphor for the deer or an analog to the deer. The deer was the analog to it. In this case, I thought about a thing being excavated and having a long ramp that comes out. Again, each of these, I'm thinking about the ways to get into it. This one is the digital rendering of that previous piece. It won the K-Brow Prize for Best Digital Image. Again, I began to think about, what if I'm seeing things in the sky? What if I'm seeing worlds within worlds? What if I'm beginning to see things using the digital tools within it? And how can I begin to use these tools in ways that are beyond the simple ways that they've been intended, right? To render as realistically as a thing, right? How can I begin to expand the ways that we're thinking about the space? How can I begin to use them as tools to render how our non-human relatives are seeing them? So these are all ways of thinking about each of these. I do have a series of models, physical models that go along with these that are in process. So there are 13 moons. I have 8 of these complete, a 9th one that's in progress. So the intent is to make all 13. They're not intended to have any specific site or place. They're really just intended to expand these notions about each of those parameters that I've set up and the ways that I begin to draw and represent them. I think that, again, there should be a reciprocal relationship between the things that we design and the ways that we represent them. If you're familiar with Robin Evans' arrested image diagram, he has the designed object in the middle and the different ways that we begin to see it and represent it. But I think that the way that it's described, it's a one-way process. And I think that it can actually be a reciprocal process. So when I teach, I largely teach in representation as my sort of area of expertise. I talk about that relationship in that diagram and the ways that we draw and think, and how can those things be informing the designed object itself? Can it actually be part of the design process and not always as a reflexive tool, right? The designed object is conceived, and then we draw it, and then we model it, and then we draw construction documents of it, and then we build it. But what if there were a process in which those things can be reciprocal? And that's what I was trying to explore in these pieces, in these drawings, in the ways that I draw, and even to not be as sort of parsing things or editing things as they're coming out. That everything kind of deserves to be drawn, even though I may not know how to draw it. I just have to instinctually figure that out, right? So that was what I was doing with that piece, or the series of drawings. The last theme is decolonize, right? Decolonization, and how do we begin to do that? I think the first thing I want to talk about is when we're thinking about decolonizing, we have to understand what colonization is. And for me, it has a very specific definition. And this definition comes from the Tuck and Yang article about, it's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. But it's very specifically related to the dispossession of land from Indigenous people in the US and Canada. So to truly decolonize, land has to be given back. Right? It's about the land and how it was taken and how people were separated from it and how people were physically removed from it and estranged from it. And those relationships were intended to be broken down to begin to think about that. But I do think that there are other forms of colonization. There's settler colonialism, but I also think there's intellectual colonialism as well. And how do we begin to do that? And how can design start to do that? This is a piece that I recently completed. It's called Otichea, or crane in the Menominee language. Lawrence University is a private university in Appleton, Wisconsin, just south of Green Bay. So they're on Menominee land. They approached me to do a permanent piece that acknowledged that fact because they always wanted people to know that they're and that the university acknowledges that it's on Menominee land. And I'm Oneida. We're not that far from Menominee in Wisconsin. But one of the things that I began to look at, and I think is a way to begin to think about Indigenous groups, is their art and the way that they express things, and particularly how they express nature. The Menominee happen to abstract things in these sort of geometric shapes. In Oneida, we actually use a very sort of flowy, more organic way of making things, beadwork and other sorts of things. So that was one of the things that I was trying to accomplish with the piece. The other is to begin to see and understand how the piece is situated in relationship to the current Menominee Reservation, which is this box, and where Lawrence University is located, and that sort of, it's almost a 75-degree angle between Appleton, Wisconsin, and Kashina, where the Menominee people are located. So this is the land base of the Menominee. If you want to know whose land you're on, there's a website called nativeland.ca. You can type in your location, you can type in your zip code, and it will tell you. And a map like this is where that image came from. Will come up, it'll show you the different people that are indigenous to those areas. So this is the Menominee land base. It's most of Wisconsin. Milwaukee is down here. Appleton happens to be here. Oneida, where I'm from, the reservation is here. And so when my people came to Wisconsin, we purchased the land with the Menominee in that area of the state. But this is the piece. It's made of weathering steel. It has a custom perforation. That perforation is intended to reflect the patterns within those geometric patterns. It's within a prominent area of the university with this main plaza. And this is it under construction, was recently completed. We dedicated the piece on Indigenous Peoples Day this year. The weathering steel has already started to rust, but part of it is that I want people to understand that this is a device for seeing the sky and beginning to see that connection. I do think that architectural installations differ from art installations in some specific ways. For me, it's I'm trying to put forth a spatial agenda, a thing that occupies space and the thing that people can get into, an experiential agenda, what happens to you once you're inside the thing, and a material agenda, right? Or a tectonic agenda, whether the thing is panelized or the things go over each other, and the perforations and how light comes into the piece, and how we begin to see how the things changes the way that we begin to see how materials and space interact with one another. So one of the things that was a really sort of great coincidence with the perforations is that when you're inside the piece and the sun is shining through it, the pattern gets cast upon you and the pattern gets cast back upon the space and the material. So that experiential thing actually happens within the perforations. So let's begin to talk about what colonization is and the sort of aspects of it in order to begin to think about how do we decolonize, and I'll talk about that as well. So I borrow these terms from Linda Smith's book called Decolonizing Methodologies. It's about research in Indigenous communities, and how you begin to think about that research and how you should kind of conduct yourself. So she has developed this vocabulary of colonialism to explain it, right? The first is the line, the map to survey our territory, to begin to say like the 13 original colonies or the Louisiana Purchase or the US, right? To draw a boundary around it. And then that boundary is then surveyed and gridded out. And those were ways of taking land from individuals. It was a device used to do that. The second is the center, or the orientation to the system of power, right? To create the capital or to create that center. Like the Italians put a church in the middle of their settlements, right? This idea of creating a center within that line. The third thing is the outside, and that the territory and people are in oppositional relation to the center, meaning the center is inside, you're outside, us, them, build a wall, keep them out. That is all part of colonization. Now, these things can happen, I think, physically, but they can also happen in figurative ways, right? Like non-literal ways or non-material ways. We can begin to separate ourselves from one another, whether it's through culture, it's through politics, it's through place, it's through economics, it's through any other intellectual things, it's about education. Like there are just different ways for us to draw boundaries between one another. And this map is the triangulation of all of the federal Indigenous reservations within the US, and then top 50 are highlighted by population in purple. But when you begin to see here is that many of those reservations are pushed towards the west, right? We can see in this sort of Oklahoma area that was called Indian Territory, where people were displaced from their lands and placed in that area, and where they actually are. I do think that the thing that fuels colonization, the thing that it thrives on and is continued to be perpetuated by, is a lack of empathy. It is the one thing it's a tool that we can use to decolonize, right? That if we began to think about being empathetic to one another, if we began to think about how can I be empathetic as a designer to the people that I'm making things for, in the communities that I'm working within, or my thinking about my colleagues or my students, or the students thinking about one another, how can we begin to think about being empathetic, and how can we as educators train our students to be more empathetic? I think that lies within the ways that we administer projects and the types of projects we administer, right? Because I think that architectural education has been very good at teaching us the what and the how, right? To say this building and this is how you execute it, this is how you design the museum or the opera or whatever it is that you're designing, the center for this, that, and the other. We're very good at that. The thing that we haven't been so good at is teaching you the who and the why. Why are you making this thing, and who are you making it for? And I think that's where this role of empathy can come into play. It can come into the ways that we're administering projects, again, in the communities that we serve. And I think that's very broad. I don't think of it as just a sort of humanitarian aid sort of thing, but it's really just about how we interact with one another. How do we interact with a corporation? How do we interact with the university? How will we interact with a very specific community? Those are the ways that we begin to do that. This last project I'll show you is an ongoing research project. I began to study the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of 1969 to June of 1971. This was a time when the island was decommissioned as a prison. It was put into federal land surplus. A group of Indigenous students from the University of San Francisco took a boat ride. They convinced someone to take a boat ride around the island. They said they wanted to see it at night. When they got 3/4 of the way around, they actually jumped off the boat into the water and got onto the island. There was only one person on the island. It was a caretaker because the land was in government surplus. So the Department of the Interior was basically overseeing it. But they occupied the island through the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was a treaty that was made with the Lakota people. And in that treaty, the federal government, keep in mind, this is a treaty made between two sovereign nations, the Lakota and the US government. The US government said any land that we deem a surplus you could have, and that's why they occupied the island, to enforce that treaty, the things that the US government had promised them. To me, the really intriguing and very interesting part of that occupation was they didn't want the island for political or economic gain. They didn't want it for that kind of leverage. What they wanted it for was to build an Indigenous university, cultural center, and ecological center. They wanted architecture. They wanted architecture to be the thing that that they used the island for, right? And they created this group called the Indians of All Tribes Incorporated. It was a way for them to gather funds. You can see here there's an ID, so everyone who had an identification for the occupants that were on the island. They began to teach school there. They had a radio show that was broadcast every day. The University of San Francisco let them borrow their airwaves to create this show. All of this was really intriguing to me. So I wrote a grant that was from my previous university, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I suppose that they got what they wanted, and they were going to make a Indigenous university, and I was going to design that university. So when I began to explore this, the research on this island, one of the things I thought was really powerful was the graffiti on the island. The graffiti is this kind of rhetoric of resistance. It is something that they use to, I think to begin to decolonize the land itself, right? They began to remind people that you're on Indian land, that Alcatraz Island even of itself is Indigenous land. They use the graffiti that cross out all the things that refer to the federal land or United States property. You can see here they crossed out states and put in Indian land. This graffiti is actually still on the island. It's part of their history. The island is a national park. If you haven't been there, it's a really amazing thing to see the graffiti still there. It was placed on the water tower, and I think within the last 10 years or so, they restored that graffiti. But for me as a project, I wanted to use it as a way to demonstrate how I thought about Indigenous architecture and how was I going to make architecture for Indigenous people. But I began to think about the complexities of this thing at the beginnings of the project, right? How was I going to express all of these complexities, the complexities of the treaty relationship, how lands were taken, how people saw this as an opportunity to begin to express Indigenous culture. How was I going to make a place that was used to exclusively educate Indigenous people? So it changed the way that I draw. It changed the way that I began to think about this project. And so I started to make these series of drawings. They're all on Mylar. I draw on the front and the back. I use colored leads, pencils, stickers, images. I draw on these layers in different ways. And as these things became more complex, I began to theme the drawings. And so this one is about trajectories. And so how many different ways could I think about trajectory? One of the first things I did was I drew every edge of the building on this off the page. I began to really think about the trajectory of sound. How was I going to draw this immaterial thing? So I had to invent ways of drawing. I began to research different things that were associated with the island. I used navigational maps, the aeronautical maps, the airline traffic over it, and the nautical maps, ship pathways, the ferry pathways. All of these things were starting to the ways that I drew, and I indexed them or traced them onto these drawings on the front and the back. When I drew these, I did them in a way that I didn't really think about the overall composition. I wasn't concerned with composition with each one of these, so I drew them one layer at a time, and what you're looking at is the composite. But one of the layers here is I began to think about the trajectories of colonization, the trajectories of genocidal trajectories, right? This idea that the people that were indigenous to the southeastern part of the US were marched and literally walked to Oklahoma as a device to basically exterminate them, and many people lost their lands in that way, lost their lives along that way. My people, the Oneida, came from New York State, upstate New York, and moved to Wisconsin in the 1820s. And like I said, they purchased the land with the Menominee people. So there are two federally recognized tribes, one in Wisconsin where I'm from, and then one in New York. And this is the pathway that they took. And so I began to think about this idea of trajectory. So this is about three layers of Mylar front and back that I'm drawing on in different ways. For me, it's about how I was trained as an architect. When I went to architecture school in the 90s, most of our presentation drawings were ink on Mylar and graphite on Mylar. And so that's just kind of how I draw. So I'm using the architectural language and sort of deconventionalizing it, right? Taking the conventions away, the conventions of a dotted line, what a dotted line means, or a solid line. In some ways, decolonizing the line in that way. This one is about territories. It's about territories, different types of territory, how territories are claimed. I'm using geological maps. I'm using landscape maps, vegetation maps. I'm using petroglyphs as ways of claiming territory. And this one I'm looking at land secession between just on 2 different states, South Dakota and Wisconsin. So that history, this was called the Dakota Territory, which was established in 1851 by the federal government. The federal government comes in and says, well, you can't have all of that, you can have this. And then they shrunk that. They said, you can't have all that, you can have this. And then when they established the federal reservation boundaries in 1889, those are the ones that are highlighted in yellow. My people, the Oneida, when we first moved to Wisconsin in 1820, like I said, we purchased this land with the Menominee. The federal government came in 1831 and said, you can't have all of that, you can have this. So we purchased that land. So then we purchased that land twice. And then in 1838, the federal reservation boundary was established. And then we purchased that land a 3rd time. So we were occupying land that we purchased 3 times. And then in the late 1800s, the Dawes Allotment Act, which allotted all of the land to tribal members, but then didn't tell them that they had to pay tax on it, and then took the land when they couldn't pay the taxes, was a way of taking the land. It was part of all of the colonization that happened in our country. But all that to say that we don't own all of the land within that reservation boundary. The land base was very low at one point. We don't own all of it. I couldn't give you a percentage, but it's less than 50%, I believe. So anytime land becomes available, the tribe buys it, but then there's a long process to put it in trust. It's in a federal trust, and within that boundary, that's where we're sovereign. We're sovereign within that boundary. So it's all a very complicated relationship. And the point here is to say, well, there's this relationship that the U.S. government had with the people in that land and how it's used as a tool to colonize different individuals. So there are many different things about this particular drawing. For me, the drawings were a way of thinking, right? I wasn't necessarily thinking about how other people were going to read that, but each of these drawings, but to begin to help explain some of the things that were within it. In architecture schools, we're not talking about truly American architecture, meaning like where architecture started, right? We're not talking about places like Acoma Pueblo. The Pueblos were some of the first cities in the United States, or Cahokia Mounds were other cities that were established in the US, or what we would identify as cities. Pueblos are the first multi-story buildings in the US. We're not talking about that in our history courses, and we should be, and those things are drawn within this drawing. Chaco Canyon, here in New Mexico, it was, if you think of it as a building, which it ostensibly is, a single building, it has more square feet in it than any skyscraper that was built in Chicago, right? Like if we talk about in our history classes that where the skyscraper began, and how that started to develop into this larger idea of architecture, we should be starting here, right? We should be talking about this. We can also use this in our building technology courses because it's masonry that rivaled what the Romans were doing, and there's just no way that they could have communicated with one another, right? They figured out how to make round masonry buildings. They figured out how to make lintels. They figured out how to make apertures and openings that were aligned with the sun and the moon. These are all very important lessons, and we should be thinking about them. I believe that when we start architecture projects and we give you like a site analysis part of studio, you should be starting with the Indigenous history. We shouldn't be just starting with when the place was founded, or when it was named, or when the city became a city. We should be looking at the Indigenous history of that particular place. Like I said, there are petroglyphs within this. There's a group that are 3D scanning petroglyphs in order to preserve them, because petroglyphs are a way of carving into stone and beginning to claim territories. One of the things that's indexed in this drawing is the date, 12/29/1890. This is the massacre at Wounded Knee, which happened on the Lakota territory. This is the United States government. About 300 people were gunned down, unarmed people. Most of that 300 were women and children. Most of the men were out fighting the US Army. And what you're looking at here is an image of the United States Army. This is how those 300 people were buried in the earth. And so when things like the Dakota Access Pipeline happen and they ignore the archaeological reports that say that these people are buried within this land, that's one of the biggest things that they have an issue with, right? It's not just about contaminating the water, but it's also that their ancestors are buried here. Now, this image, I think, is really important for us to begin to understand the truths and the true relationship of the United States government with Indigenous people. That it is a genocidal relationship, right? The intent here was to exterminate us. At some point, we were 100% of the population of this land, and now we're barely 1% of it. And these were the tactics that were used. These individuals in the Army got medals for this, right? When they shot these unarmed people who were just dancing in ceremony. That's all they were doing. And think of this, the fact that this was in the middle of winter as well. And so these people were buried in the earth in this way. So to begin to think that these sort of atrocities are not part of our history is a fallacy. But I think that if we're going to approach anything that is reconciliation, we just need to be truthful. I'm not advocating for us to hold anyone accountable. I'm just advocating for the truth. Let's talk about these things. Let's have honest conversations about them. And then let's decide what we're going to do with that information. What are we going to do with this information as designers? As people who are intervening in these landscapes, I think that we should know this history. I think, us as architects, as landscape architects, as urban planners, anyone that's intervening in the physical landscape should know this history, because we should know the indigenous histories of this place. And we haven't been able to really dig into that. So many people ask me, well, where do I start? Part of the places that you start are finding these surveys. What I found in Wisconsin was that before Wisconsin became a state, it was surveyed. Most of the entire state was surveyed. And the person that surveyed it, his name was Increase Lapham. And he was a surveyor. And his job was to survey the state. And that's exactly what he did. So when he gridded the state and he walked each of those lines and he wrote down what he saw, he wrote every indigenous settlement he found. He found oak savannas that were managed landscapes by the indigenous people. He found hundreds of mounds. And when he found a mound, he measured it, he surveyed it, he mapped it. He didn't make any political decisions about what he was doing. He was just doing his job. And I would venture to guess that at least most of the US states, that similar activity happened. And so it's a place, what I found was when I began to dig into it, I found all of this information in our state historical society, but people hadn't dug it up. People hadn't found it. So it was a place to begin to start because the cities were just built on top of these mounds, on top of these indigenous settlements. And these are mapped in 1835. Wisconsin became a state in 1848. So what I'm giving you is part of the information to begin to dig into, just dig deeper into information, into historical societies, into people that documented maps. These things exist, and we just have to be able to find them. I think that it helps us to understand how people settled the land, how people understood it. And the sort of misnomer or sort of misunderstanding about this land when Columbus arrived, it wasn't a wild frontier or a thing. It was a highly managed landscape. There were political systems, there were economic systems, there were systems of trade, there were systems of transportation, there were infrastructural systems that were here for tens of thousands of years. And so if we're going to figure out how to correct the things that we're doing on the earth, I think that we have to begin to think about indigenous knowledge systems and begin to think about that it being a part of the ways that we educate architects. So just to finish up, this project is in process, and I'm doing these massing studies. Like I said, I'm going to design this university, and I'm beginning to think about how can I make a building that is like an animal, inhabits the site like an animal. How will it differ from how other people are educated? If young indigenous people are coming here to to be educated, what does that really mean? So the three themes, design as ceremony, drawing as medicine, and decolonization, I think that these can be a foundation for a curriculum. For me, now as the chair here at the University of New Mexico, what I'm trying to do to begin to decolonize the curriculum is to augment the ways that we've been teaching architecture, to add Indigenous history into our courses, into our history courses. It's a matter of the examples that we're showing students in our technology courses, in our history courses, in our design studios, and like I said, in the site analysis that we do. This is how we begin to layer these things in and how we begin to think about them. So me as an Indigenous person and an educator, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So I'll leave you with this thought. This is the two-row wampum belt. It is a belt that was made by the Mohawk. So the Mohawk and the Dutch came to a point where they realized that they had to figure out how they were going to go forward, how they were going to coexist in the land, how they were going to continue to trade with other European countries, other European settlers. So the Dutch wrote a document, which was the sort of European method, right? And the Mohawk signed the document. But the Mohawk made this artifact, this wampum belt. It's called the two-row wampum belt. And what it symbolizes, the two dark bands that you see are the two canoes, the canoe of the Dutch and the canoe of the Mohawk, or the non-Indigenous and Indigenous, and that they decided to go forward parallel and equal with one another. It didn't take long for that treaty to be broken, but the point was that they saw each other as equals. And so when I'm thinking about how I have used my own architectural education, I was the one that was layering Indigenous content. I never saw anything Indigenous. I never saw anything Indigenous in my architectural education. I had to find that. But now I have the opportunity to begin to layer that information in with the education that we're delivering here. And when I think about this metaphor of the two canoes, I straddle both canoes as an academic and an Indigenous person. Sometimes when the waters get rough, I can't straddle both canoes, right? I have to pick a canoe to get into. Sometimes it's the non-Indigenous or academic canoe. Sometimes it is the Indigenous or cultural canoe for me. But I understand from my existence, I am trying to straddle both of these. And that is the way that I begin to think about my role in the world as a design professional and as a design educator. Yawako, thank you.